Today on the Roundhouse, we are investigating the Great Train Robbery. All aboard!
In days past, the roundhouse was where the railroad worker united with the steam locomotive, each to prepare for the journey ahead. Today, it's where we examine the history, the industry, the machines, the hobby, and the passion behind railroading. News, interviews, stories, and more. So climb aboard. This is The Roundhouse.
Welcome to the Roundhouse. I'm your host, Nick Russell-Pavier, and this is episode number 62 of our Trains and Railroading podcast, where we're talking about everything in the industry and the hobby. You know how it goes, you name it, and we discuss it. Today, we are talking with author Nick Russell-Pavier, who's written a fantastic book on the Great Train Robbery of 1963. If you've never heard this real-life tale of a £2 million heist that took place over 50 years ago that still has an impact on how heist crimes are viewed today, then grab your detective gear because we're about to investigate the myth and the reality. Our guest today is the author of The Great Train Robbery, Crime of the Century, The Definitive Account, and has served as a consultant on several productions about the Great Train Robbery. Please welcome to the Roundhouse, Mr. Nick Russell-Pavier.
Hi, Nick.
Great to have you on the show, Nick. Also amusing to have another Nick on the show. What was the crime scene in the UK like before the Great Train Robbery?
Well, in the UK and in the southeastern London in particular, Britain was sort of suffering from an enormous crime wave, and the police were really struggling to stay on top of it. So, due to a number of factors, but it was fair to say that period was pretty crime-ridden.
So, what were the economic conditions that were leading to the nature of all of this crime?
It comes really out of the back of the Second World War, and in some respects, as far as British people are concerned, I think what was very influential in their lives is there was a lot of American films and American movies and American lifestyle kind of images in their lives, which they were exposed to in a way that they hadn't been before. That gave birth to a very dangerous word, which is aspiration.
And how does aspiration prove to be particularly dangerous in this atmosphere?
I mean, I'm using the word dangerous in a facetious way. Basically, it's dangerous in that if you are somebody who doesn't have much or your prospects are not that great, and you see other people whose lives are not downtrodden, who have maybe opportunities and a lifestyle and a way of looking and being, which is somehow more free and celebratory and everything. And these were very much the images that British audiences received through American films and pictures, and it sort of gave them a glimpse of a less class-ridden, less downtrodden society where people sort of basically started out pretty poor and ended up just a poor at the end of it. It's not that those people don't exist in America, but the images that we were getting from America, I think at that time, were very influential in giving birth to this idea of what people had an aspiration for, a classless society, or at least a less class-bound society, which, Britain still suffers from to some extent today.
One person who was very influenced by that, in particular, that atmosphere, was Bruce Reynolds. Introduce us to the key players of the robbery.
Well, Bruce Reynolds actually has sort of become the kind of figurehead for the whole thing in many ways. That's partly due to publicity, which he himself promoted after being released from prison in the late 70s. So to some extent, one has to sort of strip away some of the manufactured mythology and imagery that effectively the criminals themselves have constructed in the latter part of their lives. And when they got out of prison, their prospects were fairly bleak. So to try and become a sort of celebrity of some sort was a possible route to getting some income and some sort of kind of life other than doing menial work. Bruce Reynolds as a character is quite interesting in that he was always somebody who had this sort of aspiration to be something other than perhaps the man he was born to be. You know, this idea of the sort of Cary Grant catch a thief character, the glamour that went with it. And again, it's a sort of American movie sort of a concept, but with the proceeds of the crimes that he committed before the Great Train Robbery, he drove an Aston Martin at one point. He drunk in a pub in Belgravia, which is a very smart part of London. He had his suits handmade at Savile Row, which is a very sort of upmarket tailoring area. So he came from a very ordinary family, but he always had this kind of idea of living a sort of fantasy life. And crime was his sort of kind of, if you like, his pathway out of being a very ordinary working class boy. That's the way he saw it. He's the most interesting, in many ways, psychologically, of the great train robbers, and has certainly self-styled himself as being sort of mastermind or the leader of the gang and all these things. In reality, that wasn't the case. The crime came about really through one of the other participants, a guy called Gordon Goody. The year before, in 1962, Gordon Goody, along with Bruce Reynolds and a few other people who were in the Great Train Robbery, carried out a wages snatch at London Airport, Heathrow as it's now named, but it was then known as London Airport. And the British state airline, BOAC, had their headquarters there. Again, with inside information, one of the characters, a guy called Charlie Wilson, who was also in the Great Train Robbery gang, had heard that on a Tuesday, there was a lorry, or in fact a van, that went from Barclays Bank at London Airport to BOAC headquarters, which was called Comet House, with the cash wages for the BOAC staff. And so with a bit of planning and observation, they set about doing a wages snatch and intercepted the van and the guards and got away with the box full of money. And in 1962 money, it was £62,000, but you can multiply that several times over to get to what it would be worth today. It was a very big haul, and that particular robbery was brilliantly executed and quite imaginative. They all dressed up in pinstripe suits and had kind of Jaguars, which were the kind of fashionable car of the time, as well as being fast cars for getting away from crimes. And there was a kind of already the seeds of a kind of combination of crime and sort of theatre in a way, strangely. There was a kind of cheekiness about it, almost as you get in those sort of crime films of the 60s. They were sort of living in reality, and it was quite interesting, really, how that kind of caught their imagination. Again, possibly Bruce Reynolds would be encouraging of that particular sort of angle on it. So, cut a long story short, Gordon Goody, who was in a part of that gang at the London Airport robbery, was actually arrested and subsequently was taken to trial. And the solicitors who represented him at his trial, in fact, got him off with a very clever piece of legal manoeuvring. But without going into that, the solicitor's clerk was a guy called Brian Field. Not long after Gordon Goody got off the charge for the airport job, Brian Field called him and said that he had some inside information about trains that carried large amounts of money. Brian Field, as well as being a solicitor's clerk, was also a broker of this kind of information. And he saw opportunities with criminals going through his office every day to do a bit of sort of matchmaking between various criminal parties and put things together, of course, for financial gain. Anyway, Gordon Goody was introduced through Brian Field to this mysterious man who he met in a park in London, who effectively was a post office worker. What he had to say was quite extraordinary, was that on a nightly basis, travelling post offices, which were basically railways with sorting carriages, they weren't passenger railway trains, they were trains that carried mail. And during the course of their journey, post office workers would be sorting the mail to their destinations, and also as they went down the line, grabbing mail bags off contraptions where mail bags were hung at the side of the track, and an automatic arm sort of grabbed the mail. It came on board, they sorted it, and they dropped mail off and sorted it and collected mail all the way down the line. And it was really quite a major part of the distribution of the Royal Mail in those days. Anyway, that was all well known, but what wasn't known is that on those trains, there was a carriage called the High Value Package Coach. And in that coach, there were bags of cash. And the idea of why that cash was being transported around was that, of course, people didn't have credit cards in those days. A lot of transactions were done with cash. regional banks all over the country would carry a certain amount of cash at the bank, but anything surplus to their daily requirements, they would return to head offices in London. So on a nightly basis, quite large amounts of money were being transported overnight in these mail trains. And the particular train that this guy knew about was a train that came down from Glasgow in Scotland down to Euston Station in London. And he sort of knew a bit about both where the carriage was in the train. It was always the third carriage, and the fact that it was extraordinary, but there was no security on the train, no security measures. There were sort of bars at the window, but it was pretty sort of flimsy sort of locks. No means of communication from the train to the outside world. And these trains carried literally millions of pounds, which seemed quite staggering at the time, almost too good to believe. And in some ways, what was remarkable is nobody had ever thought of stealing money from these trains before.
Yeah, it's interesting that it just hadn't come up. And so the trains weren't protected. The information was somewhat protected, but clearly it was out there. Guards, there weren't really any to speak of in the carriage. So it's really new territory for everybody involved. And as we'll see, even those who carried out the crime were quite shocked at what was to come. So when they got this information and they understood what they could potentially benefit from this, what was the game plan that they laid out?
Well, initially, it was quite a complicated idea in that their previous crime the year before was a wages snatch. It's quite a simple thing. You've got a lorry or a van with a box of money and some guards, and you just go and overpower the guards, get the box, put it in the back of your car and drive off. It's sort of smash and grab kind of crime. Or even a bank, when you do a bank job, you go into the bank, you pull out a gun or something like that, and the people give you the money and you drive away. But here you've got a train, it's a moving target, it's traveling over quite a long distance, and you've got to stop the train and you've got to somehow work out how you're going to get hold of the money with all these postal workers on board. There were sort of 70-odd people on board the train. So, it's a more complicated crime. And in many ways, that was sort of part of the undoing of it, in that they overcomplicated the planning more than they really needed to, because there were various different aspects to it, which to some extent caused them problems in trying to work out the best way to do it. I mean, in short, all you've of course got to do is stop the train somehow, go to the coach with the money in, and effectively break in and grab the bags and drive away. But it is, as you can see, a sort of slightly more complicated thing. How do you stop the train? Where do you stop the train? There are lots of factors which you can't really know fully how it's going to work with the people who are on the train. So they decided that the place to stop it would be in a quiet part of the countryside, not too far away from London, which is where they all came from. That all seemed pretty straightforward. They spent a long time trying to find a place which would be suitable. And in the end, they came up with a bit of a compromise where they had a great spot to stop it, which was in the middle of the Buckinghamshire countryside, which is just about 45 minutes outside the city of London. But there was a slight problem in that the signal, the light that hung over the track, was about 1,100 yards away from the nearest point of the access for the road where they could unload it. So the first of the complications then arose is that they'd have to stop the train, and then by fooling the people that, that it was a genuine red light and not something that had been tampered with, and then they would have to move that train, well, at least the locomotive and the money coach, this 1,100 yards down to a bridge where they could then unload it onto a truck. So that was the first area of complication, and that on the night of the robbery did cause them quite a lot of technical problems, because it involved having to move the train and to uncouple the money coach and the locomotive from the rest of the carriages where all the postal workers were. So it already was getting technically quite a complicated crime to carry out, and you'd need the expertise of a person who knows how signals work, a person who knows how couplings work on trains, and somebody possibly to drive the train, because if the train driver refused to drive it, they would be stuffed. They wouldn't be able to move it down to the bridge to unload it. So those are just the initial things that they came up against when they were thinking, okay, great, there's this train with all the money on, but how do we get hold of it? It's quite a complicated business.
So they work out this plan with all its various complex details, and then finally they also have to work out an escape plan to an extent, partially escape, partially hideout. So there was a critical farmhouse involved in all of this as well.
There was. I mean, there was some debate between the gang as to whether or not they were actually only 45 minutes from Marble Arch, which is a kind of famous landmark in London in the middle of the West End, in terms of a straight drive home. And one of the gang, a guy called Roy James, who was actually also amateur racing driver, was in favour of driving back to London with some specially prepared cars, not unlike the film of The Italian Job, which of course, to some extent, borrows its origins from the Great Train Robbery in a way. And this is another insight into the idea of the criminal mind and how it works. Of course, that would have been a good idea. There was somebody who raised a point about, well, maybe the police would have roadblocks up, but in reality, the police wouldn't respond effectively at 3:00 in the morning, get roadblocks up within 45 minutes of the robbery. So that was a kind of a little bit of a detail, a minor concern possibly. But the principal concern actually in most of the criminals' minds were, once they'd unloaded those mailbags, nobody wanted to let them out of their sight until they'd been opened. They knew how much there was inside them and each person had their share. And that, in some respects, this idea of honour amongst thieves certainly didn't exist with the gang. So one thing led to another. And in the end, somebody came up with an idea that they should have a local hideout close to where they're going to carry out the robbery. They would then be able to withdraw and effectively what they thought disappear, just lie low in a hideout while the police were running around the countryside trying to find them. They then made a classic sort of city boys error, which is they're thinking, well, in the countryside, there's not that many people around, so it's a good place to hide. But I'm speaking as a person who lives in the country. Of course, you can't go anywhere in the middle of the country, and I guess it must be the same in America. If you're in a small community, rural community, everybody knows what's going on. If a stranger comes in or somebody goes down the road wearing a different coat, everybody started talking about it within 5 minutes. So the country is the most conspicuous place to hide out. The best place to hide is a city.
Right. Makes absolute sense. But it's interesting to see the different avenues the whole thing could have taken. And those only increase as we delve further. They work out the heist. They work out the hideout. Now, take us to the 8th of August, 1963. Take us to that night and that train.
The gang were all sitting in their hideout called Leatherslade Farm. It was actually a small holding, but it was a farmhouse sort of in rural Buckinghamshire, about 28 miles from the place where they were going to carry out the robbery. And another piece of theatre which they kind of invented was they all dressed up in military uniform and painted their vehicles, which was a truck and 2 Land Rovers, 4-wheel drive kind of Jeep type things. They painted them in army colours, and so the idea was there were various army bases in the area. It wouldn't draw attention seeing these vehicles in the middle of the night driving around because there were military vehicles around and they were doing exercises and stuff like that. To some extent, it was kind of okay as an idea. I mean, there were some pretty obvious errors in that they didn't have military registration plates or license plates, as you call them, on the vehicles. So that was an easy thing to spot, and it seems like a silly error to have made. There were other things about the way that they conceived that, which meant that actually latterly after the robbery, or whilst they were at the end of the robbery, one of the people on the train spotted the vehicle from where he was being held and noticed that it looked like a military vehicle. So, of course, that kind of then made it identifiable, whereas if it had just been any old truck, it would have been less easy for him to see in the dark. So for every problem they thought they solved, they kind of also created a secondary problem which they hadn't foreseen. Another thing they did before the robbery was they went round and cut all the telephone wires all around the area, thinking, well, then nobody will be able to phone the police and tell them that something's happening if there is somebody around or somebody jumps off the train and goes to try and find a telephone. However, 20 minutes before the robbery, when they were doing this, the local telephone exchange got an alarm signal to say that these lines were down and sent out an engineer to go and repair them. So rather than the idea of using the telephone cutting as a way of avoiding attention, they attracted attention. So there were all sorts of very basic errors about their thinking, which once you start unpicking it, and you're talking about this thing which has become known as the Great Train Robbery, it's a mystery as to why it is these details have never really sort of taken root in people's minds over what did take root, which is this kind of image of something rather romantic and extraordinary.
Right, putting it to the man. And it does seem like there was such a media blitz surrounding this that I think even when I look at articles covering the deaths of certain members or revelations about what happened, it still exists to this day.
So we go back to what's happening on the night. Sorry, I kind of went off on a tangent there. They needed to stop the train at around about 15 minutes after 3 a.m. That's what the time that they were pretty sure the train would be coming down the tracks. It was regular as clockwork. It left. They knew that it had left Glasgow at a certain time, and this was the timetable that it kept. Obviously, trains are pretty reliable in that way in terms of knowing where they're going to be at what time. So they left dressed up in their army uniform and headed 28 miles cross-country to this place called Bridego Bridge, which is the bridge where they had decided was the perfect spot. Everybody took up positions. There's some debate as to where people were and what they did. Bruce Reynolds said that he was way up the track looking for the train, and we can come to why I think that's untrue in a minute. But anyway, there was some kind of lookout, and there were two people at the two signals. There was kind of an advanced signal, which was to warn the train that there was a stoplight ahead. So that was a kind of like an amber light when you get on the road. It's just to tell people to slow down. Well, this was to tell the train that there was a stoplight ahead, to give them time to brake. And then somebody was doing that, and another guy was doing the stoplight. This is where, again, the idea of the Great Train Robbery becomes more like a kind of Boy Scout exercise, because the method they used for doctoring these lights was to use a black leather glove to cover the green light and a 9-volt battery with some crocodile clips to clip onto the red light. And that was it. I mean, my 10-year-old son could do that, I reckon.
That's crazy that it was so simple. But yeah, it didn't work. That's insane.
Well, it worked, except for the guy at the amber light messed it up, because for whatever reason, either he'd forgotten the procedure or he panicked or whatever. But the reason why they had to just clip these lights and cover the green light and clip the crocodile clips onto the red light was that if they had actually cut the wires or unscrewed the bulb, it would, of course, set off an alarm in the signal box. And the signalman up the track would know that there'd been a light failure because there was a fail-safe light warning system. Although this is simplicity itself, the guy at the first light, for some reason, unscrewed the bulb. And so again, before the robbery even took place, an alarm went off in the signal box, which was about 15 minutes up the track. And the signalman thought that there'd been a light failure. And he again called out an engineer and said, go down to Sears Crossing, which is where this light was by the bridge. Check out, I think, we've got a bulb, we've got a faulty bulb, or we've got a wiring problem down there, but I've got an alarm. So, again, something which is so simple, if you don't do it to the letter, could cause a big problem. And again, they didn't follow this procedure. It's pretty simple, but they didn't do that. Anyway, as luck would have it, and there's a lot of luck involved in this story as far as the criminal's concerned, neither the telephone engineer who was sent out to investigate the cut wires, or the wires that were down anyway, or the signals engineer, they didn't actually arrive until after the robbery. But that was purely by chance. I mean, they could have arrived either before or during the robbery, in which case, of course, they would have raised the alarm. So that was just purely by chance, and something which the criminals themselves hadn't even factored in, they weren't even aware of when they were carrying out this crime of the century. It shows the level of planning and detail and the discipline which the team had, which was pretty shaky, actually. Anyway, as it happened, the train came down the track. The lights, were red. And so Jack Mills, the train driver, pulled up at the red light. And the procedure was that you wait at the red light, and then after a certain number of minutes, you go to a trackside phone and phone the signalman to get permission to either move on, or he'll tell you what the problem is or whatever. The assistant train driver, David Whitby, was a young guy, and he was always a bit impatient. He was never one to wait around, and he jumped down from the cab straight away to go and ring the signalman. When he got to the trackside phone, he sort of kind of picked it up and found that the wires were cut on the phone, and that sort of kind of seemed a bit strange. There was some electrification works going on the line. They were putting overhead cables in at the time on that line. But nevertheless, he may have thought there was something to do with that, but obviously the trackside phone is a piece of safety equipment, so it would be unlikely that they would dismantle it or cut it or in any way not have it working. So he was not alarmed by that, but a little bit confused. And as he was walking back to the locomotive to tell Jack that's what happened, he saw a guy down the train about the second carriage down. And he was wearing sort of overalls, and he thought maybe that he was a railway worker. And this guy beckoned him over and said, come here, mate, sort of thing. Dave called up to Jack, says, I'll go and see what's wrong. And Jack just sort of sat down, obviously thinking that everything was under control. Dave, meanwhile, got to this guy. The moment he got to him, the guy grabbed him and pushed him down the embankment of the railway line, and two other guys rolled on top of him and said, if you make a noise, we'll kill you. So, Dave Whitby was then pinned down. Jack Mills was completely unaware, the train driver, any of this was going on. A few minutes later, he heard somebody coming back to the train, or somebody get the steps of the train, looked down, and it wasn't Dave Whitby, it was a guy in a black balaclava helmet climbing up into his cab. So he obviously realized something was untoward was going on. What he didn't realize, there were 16 other guys in black balaclava helmets. So brave and courageous and proud man that he was, he tried to kick this guy off, and he had a good go at him and nearly sort of pushed him backwards off the steps. Meanwhile, another guy in a black balaclava, another member of the gang, had got in on the other side of the locomotive. There's doors either side of it. Got up behind Jack Mills and pulled him back, and three other of the gang then piled in, and there was a big bit of tussle went on. And during the time Jack Mills was struggling with these guys, he was hit quite badly over the head with an iron bar several times and sustained some very nasty head injuries and sort of rendered semi-conscious and very badly bleeding from a wound on his head. So that was not the gentlemanly crime that the robbers have since tried to portray. I mean, they say in their version of the story, of course, that this was an aberration and the guy put up a fight and, which they didn't mean to hit him or whatever it was. But this was another great revelation that I personally had when I started looking at these things in detail. In the National Archives in London are all the documents connected with the robbery. And in those documents are the witness statements taken from the guys on the train just literally an hour or so afterwards. And what was shocking was reading those witness statements is that everybody who came into contact with those criminals, i.e. the guys in the coach where the money was kept, they were hit quite badly, beaten up about the head, shoved to the floor, threatened. I mean, when the criminals broke into there, they were wielding iron bars. One guy had an axe. It was pretty violent and absolutely terrifying for these guys. So I think the violence and the intent behind the raid, those guys were prepared to do anything to get the money. And the idea that it was just kind of like they went on there and said, hello chaps, we've come to take the money, thanks very much, and it was all very gentlemanly, is complete nonsense. And of course, that's not the way criminals behave when they're all hyped up and there's a lot of money at stake. It was violent and terrifying for the victims of the crime.
It still became a smash and grab.
Yeah. The smash and grab idea is, there's money readily available, and all you've got to do is grab it, and you might have to intimidate people or stop a car or whatever. But yes, this was a smash and grab with extras. It had quite a lot of complications that went with it, as I've explained. I mean, the other thing, as a rail enthusiast, you'll appreciate the other part of the train, complication technicalities, which presented them with a problem which they didn't ultimately solve, was that they had decided that as the money coach was the third coach, the second coach was unmanned, it was just full of parcels. So they decided that they would uncouple coach 3, which had the money in, from the rest of the train, which is where the postal workers were sorting the mail, and drive just that down to the bridge, thereby distancing themselves from these 70-odd guys on the train. That, in essence, is a good idea, because obviously they didn't have to contend with other people. They couldn't have taken on 70 guys if they'd all started putting up a fight. But in uncoupling the coaches, they effectively didn't fully understand the technicalities. And on that particular kind of train, you've got a vacuum system which operates the brakes. It's not an air brake system, it's a vacuum system. So there's a pipe which holds the vacuum, and that is daisy-chained from carriage to carriage. And when you uncouple the carriage, you have to turn off a valve before you disconnect the hose. Otherwise, you compromise the vacuum. And once you compromise the vacuum, the brakes go on and they lock on until the vacuum is reinstated. And there's a pump to do that. So in uncoupling carriage 3 from the rest of the train, they didn't effectively turn the valve off before uncoupling the vacuum hose, and the brakes on the train locked on. And so when they started trying to move it with the train driver that they'd brought along, he was an old boy who didn't actually understand that because he worked as a shunter in a different part of the railway system. They tried to move the train, they put it in drive, and it didn't move because, of course, the brakes were locked solid because there was no vacuum in the system. Now, that's a technical thing which normally I wouldn't go into, but for railway enthusiasts, you'll appreciate that's an important thing. If you're going to uncouple a train, you need to know what the procedure is. You need to understand the technical side of it, because otherwise you're going to be stuffed, and they were.
Ultimately, because this driver that they'd brought as part of their team was really out of his element in terms of understanding the complications with the vacuum braking system, they ended up having to go back to Jack Mills.
Exactly so. This guy, one of the team was called Ronnie Bates, who's become a bit of a kind of celebrity of all of this thing. He was on the run for many years, and so his face is well known in the story of the Great Train Robbery. Anyway, he had suggested this old boy who was a train driver, but he wasn't familiar with this kind of locomotive or this braking system. And so after a lot of huffing and puffing, and it was obviously some very tense moments, when he was brought on board to move the train, he couldn't drive it. It couldn't move it. It didn't budge an inch. And so that was, at that point, the whole success of the robbery was effectively compromised, and he proved to be a complete waste of time. So then the only other option was to get the badly injured Jack Mills, who was sort of concussed and bleeding profusely from his head, back out of where they'd put him in the engine room and coerce him into driving the train. And of course, Jack was a very experienced driver, and he immediately knew exactly what the problem was. There's a gauge showing that the vacuum state of the vacuum brakes, and he managed to restore the pressure to some degree, although the robbers were being more and more impatient. They didn't understand what was going on. So in the end, he did get sufficient vacuum to release the brakes slightly, and went at very slow speed, I think possibly dragging the other two coaches, literally with their brakes locked on, down to the bridge. So it was again a bit of a touch and go moment. Strangely, it was only due to Jack Mills's kind of expertise that they actually managed to move at all. And so that was a sort of another strange aspect to how the crime of the century actually did happen. It was just, again, a combination of sort of chance.
So they get the train moved over to the bridge, and they're able to unload the bags into the trucks and take them back to the farmhouse. What did they discover that they had accomplished?
Well, the big question in everybody's mind was, of course, they had taken 120 mail bags. These are quite big bags, about 4 or 5 foot high, bulging with what they assumed to be money. That's what they'd told, but nobody had actually, obviously verified that. So they dragged these mail bags off the truck and get them into the house, undo them and upend them, and before their eyes tumbled out bundles and bundles of used banknotes. It was an extraordinary moment, because obviously these guys had never seen, most of us have only seen maybe a few $1,000s or pounds in our lives, but to see 2.6 million in used notes come out of these bags, it was kind of a pretty earth-shattering experience. They still obviously didn't know how much they'd got, and so the rest of that night they spent literally around a table counting it. It took a hell of a long time. It wasn't until the following morning that they'd actually managed to unpack and count all this money. But to put it into context, it's probably worth in excess of 40 million pounds today, and whatever the current exchange rate is, the dollar, you can imagine that is a huge amount of money to have in cash in your hands, particularly when you're fairly ordinary working class background, and the money you have in your pocket at the beginning of the week lasts you to the end of the week, and that's probably the most money you've ever seen. One has to enter into the spirit of what it was like for these guys, and that's what they'd aspired to. And in their minds, having a lot of money would solve everything. But as it turned out, they hadn't really worked out. They'd worked out to some degree how to get the money. What they hadn't worked out is how to get away with it and what to do with it.
It wouldn't be long before things started to unravel. We talked earlier about some of those loose ends that they had inadvertently created. How did those start to tumble and create bigger problems for them?
The first thing that really sort of shattered the plan, as far as the criminals were aware of, is that Dave Whitby, the assistant train driver mentioned earlier, they were loading the mail bags onto the truck. For some reason, and again, it's not clear, and I've spoken to a number of the gang about it, and nobody really seems to have a sort of sensible answer. Jack Mills and Dave Whitby were taken off the locomotive and held on the embankment. Whether that's just so they could keep an eye on them, I really don't know, but it would obviously have been better to keep them on the locomotive where they couldn't see anything. But, sitting on the embankment as they were, it was a moonlit night. Dave Whitby noticed that obviously the guys unloading these bags looked down the embankment, and what he saw was the fact that they were putting them onto this truck, which looked like an army truck. That was the first bit of a compromise, because the trucks that the gang had, they had planned to drive back to London in. But the following day, in the news report, because the gang, of course, were listening to the radio, they were saying that the police were looking for army-type vehicles. So that immediately scuppered their plan in terms of the fact that the only transport they had were those vehicles. They couldn't be driving around Buckinghamshire in army-type vehicles because they'd be stopped in the first roadblock. So that was a very big problem. They were then stuck in the middle of the countryside without any transport, and they had all these massive bags of money to move, and themselves, of course. So that really did worry them significantly. The other thing that came to light was that when the police really started thinking about it, and they called in some experts from Scotland Yard in London, one of the detectives sort of thought that there was a possibility that the bandits may have been hiding out somewhere locally. It's not clear exactly where that theory came from, but, it was a shrewd piece of detective work in terms of thinking, okay, so what could have happened? How did they effectively disappear into the night and nobody saw them? And so possibly a bit questionably, really, because the robbers heard it. The police put out a press report to say that they were going to be searching farms and outlying buildings within a 30-mile radius of the robbery site. Of course, the Leatherslade farm, the hideout, was 28 miles away. So the gang heard this on the radio, and it sent them into a further panic, because now not only couldn't they use their vehicles, but the police were going to be searching the area, and it wasn't going to be long before somebody came up the driveway to their place and they'd be caught red-handed.
Now they're starting to get panicked. They're starting to get worried. They're thinking they can wait it out. But then the bomb drops, in the sense that the media really starts to take off with it. What did that look like?
The whole thing with the media, and to some extent the ingredients for the mythology that was spun by the media but just caught everybody's imagination. You have to kind of look at the thing in its broadest terms. People are watching Western films in the cinema at these times. A very, very popular form of entertainment. The Jesse James gang, they're holding up trains, and it's all very glamorous, and they're riding off on their horses, and everybody thinks they're great. There's an anti-establishment feeling, which is kind of feeds into the idea that this is the Royal Mail. It's part of the establishment. The establishment's been robbed by working class boys like the Jesse James gang. It's won over on the establishment. And so that feeds into that kind of thing, which was very much part of the 60s in Britain, the slightly sort of disillusionment with the old school system, the establishment as a whole. Something new was wanted. And so all these things began to sort of kind of fuse together in a way to create the ingredients of a great story. And of course, railways and trains are very photogenic, they're romantic, they have their own sort of romanticism regardless of crime or anything else. And I don't need to explain to you, why people love railroads. And so this was another part of the ingredient that ticked up another box, that you've got the image of the train, you've got the middle of the night thing, you've got the establishment being robbed, you've got these working class guys doing a complicated thing, and also it's a hell of a lot of money, more money than's ever been stolen ever before. The press had some great photographs, and so you've got all this stuff, and it makes a perfect story. The other aspect to it, which is possibly another more subtle part of it, which is British Railways and the Post Office had effectively been caught with their trousers down. They were carrying around bank money on trains on a nightly basis without security. They hadn't seen it coming, and they were negligent. It was institutionalized negligence. They'd been caught out. So what could they say? They could say, wow, this is a really extraordinary crime. These guys are masterminds. It was like a commando raid. They were incredible the way they got away with it. Because if they told the truth, actually anybody could have stopped that train and got a hold of the money, because they were negligent. So it rather suited them that there was this kind of hype about these extraordinary people.
So this anti-establishment mentality obviously creates massive headaches then for the police who are investigating this, because on the one hand, people on some level are perhaps thinking, okay, these are bad guys, they robbed something that wasn't theirs, they need to be caught. But on the other hand, there is that romanticism. What were the police up against, and how did they embark on their investigation?
First, the police were faced with something which had never happened before. It was, first of all, investigated by the Buckinghamshire police. Now, a very rural area, the most those guys were looking at were poaching, or, somebody's stolen somebody's cow or something, or a tractor's gone missing. But suddenly to be faced with a train on which there was 2.6 million quid and now it's disappeared, I mean, it was just outside their orbit. And so the first hours of the investigation done by the local police, they were perfectly efficient in their own way, but, they were just in a realm that they just had no conception of what was going on. And so it took a bit of time for the magnitude of what's going on to sink into their minds. And it took a bit of time for it to sort of kind of filter through actually the powers that be in the post office and the railway, because obviously they'd lost a great deal of money. They were sort of putting pressure on, so what's going to happen? And an emergency meeting was eventually called with members of the post office, the railway, and people from Scotland Yard at a high level. So this all took place in London in the afternoon of the robbery, and everybody realised, okay, we've really got to go for this. This is a big deal. And so to some extent, the local police were sort of sidelined a little bit. They did the procedures as far as their limitations could cope with, but it was time to kind of get the big guns out. And so that all mobilized fairly quickly in terms of over the next day or so. But in terms of catching the robbers, it gave them a big window of opportunity, which again comes back to this question of whether they had ample time to get the hell out of there, to get home, and to carry on their lives as normal and hide the money somewhere until maybe a year later, 2 years later, just sit on it, don't do anything and don't attract attention. The other extraordinary thing about the mentality of the criminals is not one of them, well, one of them actually did have a sort of flimsy alibi, but none of the other guys had an alibi. If I was planning a crime with you, the first thing I'd be thinking about is how the hell am I going to get away with it? And because I watch films like you do, I'm thinking, I need an alibi. I want to cast out an alibi where 16 guys who are priests are going to swear on the Bible that I was nowhere near the train and I was playing cards with them or something. But that's not what those guys did. They didn't have a story. They didn't have any excuse. All they did is just disappeared, which has got to attract the biggest attention to the fact that, I'm a criminal short of wearing a T-shirt saying it.
Because of that, it took a while to track some of them down. In fact, a very long while. But when the initial players started to be rounded up, there was, of course, the big trial with the gigantic sentence. Take us to that scene and the public's reaction to that.
There's one little bit of information which I, again, found out by chance, and it absolutely staggered me. When I was looking through the post office archives, I came across a list, and that list had the names of every single person who took part in the robbery. And then there was another list which was drawn up 2 days later, and those lists were put together by members of the Scotland Yard within 2 weeks of the robbery. And that information came from informants. So actually, although there was a lot of time spent trying to track down these people, within, actually, I think about 10 days of the robbery, through police informants, Scotland Yard had the names of everybody bar 3 who were involved in the crime. So that's another kind of staggering piece of information about the crime of the century.
Even within the span of less than 2 weeks, they already knew who they were going after. It was just a matter of making it happen. And by what I gather, a lot of it was through tip-offs that they were able to round up quite a few people.
Yeah, I mean, it was a bit of good old-fashioned detective work. What was an absolute gift for them is because the robbers had exited the farm in a hurry, they'd left a mountain of evidence behind: mail bags, fingerprints, vehicles, stores, things that could be traced. But obviously the fingerprints were the most incriminating thing from a trial point of view, but there was lots of things that effectively just were careless. And the robbers have subsequently said, oh yeah, but we arranged to have the farmhouse burnt down. Well, I mean, the amount of evidence there was strewn around the whole place, even if you burned the farm down, you'd had to have napalmed it to destroy the evidence. It was just really untidy. There was evidence everywhere. And so I think what the facts point to is that they just got the hell out of there and they didn't really think about it. And latterly, because obviously they have their reputations to try and preserve, they made out there was some kind of plan for it. But I think that, to be honest, is quite clearly complete nonsense. Anyway, they did sort of leave this trail behind them, and it wasn't that long before the police found the farmhouse and came across all this evidence, of course, which ultimately was the evidence that was used to convict them. Fast forward then to the beginning of the following year of 1964, there was they had rounded up all but about 5 of the gang of 16, and there was a big trial up in Aylesbury, and at the time it was the longest criminal trial in British history. And it went on and on and on, and there was endless toing and froing. In some ways, what is extraordinary about the trial is actually, if you look at the evidence against each of the people, if they were tried independently, it is debatable as to whether or not you could have found them guilty of robbing the train, because all the evidence did was prove that they'd been to the farm and that the farm was connected to the robbery, but they did not connect the individuals who were sent to prison to the crime. And that is not beyond reasonable doubt in terms of having, through British law, having to prove somebody's guilt. The whole trial is questionable. And if you read through it, it's a very long manuscript or transcript rather of the trial. It is, I think, quite tenuous. Although it was a big show trial, there was a lot of media coverage. As I say, it was the longest trial in criminal history. But if you look at it in the cold light of day, the evidence on which each of those guys was convicted was very shaky. And none of it connected them to the crime scene. It only connected them to the farm.
So because of that, do you think that played a role in why initially their massive sentences were cut down?
No, the massive sentences, which were 30 years each, which again was unprecedented for robbery. The reason they were cut down is because in 1968, there was an introduction of the parole board in the United Kingdom, which meant that once a prisoner had served a third of his sentence, he became eligible for parole, providing he hadn't misbehaved while he was in prison. So that was just something that was still a long way off. When those sentences were handed down, you could get time off, if you like, for good behavior, but it was really the introduction of the parole board that made those sentences, and most of the guys served 10 years or thereabouts, and that was a third of their sentence. And that the reason why was because of the legislation that came in after the trial.
That was the majority of the robbers, but some of them managed to escape pretty far and wide. Obviously, a lot more than we can cover here, but what are some of the notable post-robbery lives that some of the men led?
Well, there were 2 things that happened immediately after the robbery, which kind of added to the whole kind of great story. You know, it's a great tale of sticking 2 fingers up at the establishment, as we say in Britain. Firstly, just in the summer of the year that they were sentenced, Charlie Wilson, who is one of the gang I mentioned earlier, he escaped from a high security wing in Winson Green Prison. And the reason he escaped is some mates of his got some keys cut, obviously through insiders. They paid somebody some money. They went into the prison in the middle of the night using keys that they had cut. They got to Charlie Wilson's cell and literally just walked out in the middle of the night with him, and they disappeared. So obviously not all of the facts were told at the time because everybody's highly embarrassed about it. But nevertheless, no sooner had they got the guys, no sooner had they gone through this massive long trial and sentenced to 30 years, then one of them effectively walked out of one of the highest security prisons in the UK. So that added to the whole thing. The following year, on the second anniversary, jolly nearly, just before the second anniversary of the robbery, Ronnie Bates, during an exercise period in Wandsworth Prison in London, his mates drew up in a furniture van, which had a very high sort of roof. They chucked a rope ladder over the wall, and Ronnie Biggs and a couple of other guys scaled up the rope ladder, jumped over the wall, drove off, and he was then on the run for the next 30 years. So all these things have a kind of extra value to the whole story, which is why you can see it's kept bubbling along all these years. In terms of the guys that weren't arrested at the time, Bruce Reynolds, who we were talking about earlier, he hung around unaccountably for some time after the robbery. Sort of somehow thinking he was going to be able to return to normal life. I'm not quite sure what was in his mind. He didn't really sort of explain it when I spoke to him about it. He just, I think, was a bit shell-shocked by the whole amount of publicity that was going on. In the end, he realized shortly after the trial, when these guys got 30 years, his kind of fellow criminals, that he wasn't going to get away with it and things weren't going to die down. He eventually ended up in Mexico, where he lived for a while, spending his money quite lavishly on various things. Then went to Canada latterly, which is where Charlie Wilson, who escaped from Winston Green prison, ended up in Hudson Heights, near Montreal, I think it is. So there's a kind of glamour to it, but at the end of the day, I think, and Buster Edwards also joined Reynolds in Mexico when he was there. But when you speak to them about those times, it sounds sort of glamorous, like it's something out of a movie, but they weren't happy. They were spending their money and they were sort of trying to have a good life, but they were always looking over their shoulder. And actually, at the end of the day, they were out of their comfort zone. It would be fun to go there for a couple of weeks, have a holiday, and then come home, but to actually be sort of in enforced exile from your country and everything and your family. You don't really fit into this place, so you can't find work. It's one of these things which is a bit naive in terms of, you think it'd be great to have all that money and go and live in a foreign place and be able to have smart clothes or whatever, go swimming every day, whatever your thing is. But when you're forced away from home and you have to stay away from home and you're constantly looking over your shoulder, life is not that much fun.
In talking with them, different guys would have different opinions on it. But because for each of them, this was the thing that ended up defining their lives, at least in the public sphere, do you think that they would have gone through with it again?
Yeah, I think, but I mean, I can't speak for all of them because I didn't speak to absolutely everybody. Some of them weren't available or they weren't alive or whatever. But the guys I speak to, Reynolds did it because he always had this yearning, even as a young man, to be someone. And undoubtedly, he was Bruce Reynolds, the Great Train Robber, and that made him into someone. So the fact that he'd spent 12 years in prison and he wasn't wealthy when he came out, and he ended up living in a fairly sort of impoverished way in a small flat in South London, not far from where he was brought up, possibly worse off than he would have been if he'd had a proper job. But he was Bruce Reynolds, the Great Train Robber, and I think that gave him a bit of pleasure, and I think he certainly wouldn't have had it any different, really. Charlie Wilson, he ended up, when he came out, he went over to Spain, which is where quite a lot of British criminals went at one time because they couldn't be extradited, and it was known as the Costa del Crime around there at one point because all these old villains used to go and live out there. Anyway, he got involved in drug trafficking, and then one day a guy came up on a bicycle. It was his birthday. He was getting the barbecue ready by the swimming pool. This guy came in and said he needed to see Charlie. Walked out the back, pulled out a gun and shot him dead at the swimming pool just there and then. He'd obviously offended some other drug trafficker, but that's the nature of the drugs business. But, that's again a kind of, it's like something out of a movie. It's like Martin Scorsese or something like that. But that was the end of Charlie Wilson. The boy from Battersea with the sparkling blue eyes was blown away in Marbella by his swimming pool. And so despite the fact that he at one point had a lot of money in his hand, he died young, and probably he would have quite liked to have not had that end to it, shortened end to his life. Yeah, the other guys, Tommy Wisby, who were sort of the more heavies, they were like the muscle on the job, and Jim Hussey and all those things. They ended up in fairly modest, impoverished backgrounds, and the irony is they probably ended up much the way they would have done had they just remained ordinary, regular, working class guys. But they did have that element of fame, and maybe we all want to feel that we have a piece of immortality, and that's maybe the prize that they got.
The Crime of the Century, it's quite a title, and that was in the middle of the last century. When you look at other crimes that were committed up to 2000, do you think anything ever quite toppled it, either in terms of infamy or in terms of smart execution, even if it wasn't as highly covered?
I think there have been a number of extraordinary crimes since that, in terms of robberies we're talking about. The Crime of the Century title was put on it quite early on, and I put it in the book title partly in a slightly ironic way because, of course, the book is about the fact that it's not really a crime of great ingenuity. And indeed, it's just interesting. And I guess a lot of things in history work like this when things get hold of people's imagination. As you say, even today, people are still sold on this idea that they love the story, and they, in a way, they are less interested in having that story dismantled. But you know what? The real story is much more interesting, much more human, and more kind of intriguing about how all these elements kind of swung in different ways. It's more interesting than the idea that it's the Italian Job, the Italian Job or whatever, those sort of movie things. But this is real life, and real life is messy, and it's much more interesting to understand it in that way and see it in that perspective. But I mean, in terms of the UK, there was a gold bullion heist called the Brinks heist in 1984, I think it was, where some guys stole a whole load of gold bullion from a warehouse near Heathrow Airport. Although that also has an irony to it, in that they originally went there to steal cash, and they intimidated one of the guards to try and open the safe by pouring petrol on him. This guy was freaking out so much that he forgot the combination of the safe. And while they were waiting for him to calm down, one of the criminals was nosing around the loading bay and opened a box and found all these gold bars and thought, forget the cash, let's take the gold. But they'd only had a small truck with them. So one of the other, a couple of the guys had to go off and steal a bigger truck because they had to kind of transport all this gold away. And of course, that turns into a saga in its own right. So that, how they disposed of it and everything like that, is another extraordinary story in terms of British crime. And there was a recent safety deposit box theft in Hatton Garden, which is in central London, where some guys drilled through a concrete wall and took a whole load of stuff, and nobody really knew quite what it was because it was safety deposit box. Private people, often with safety deposit box, they're putting stuff there that they don't want people to know about. So it was difficult to put a value on what had been stolen. It was a very old style crime, much like a 60s crime, because of course crime these days, people make more money from internet crime and dealing drugs than they do from drilling through concrete and stopping trains. But what was really funny, and I wrote an article for the Guardian newspaper over here about it afterwards, is that the guys who carried out that burglary turned out to be like 50, 60, 70 years old. They were all around in the 60s. So it felt like a 60s crime, and it wasn't surprising that the guys were all pensioners.
That's quite impressive in its own right.
But it was actually brilliantly done. I mean, it really was brilliant, but they were caught out because they didn't realize the police could track their mobile phones and all this other stuff. So they were caught out by the technology.
Oh, the irony of it. A crime out of its time.
It really was, yeah.
There's so many millions of parts and details to this story, and it continues to live on, and it's always going to have this mystery and myth attached for it. For you personally, Nick, what initially grabbed you into this world? What made you want to research it as heavily as you have and write about it?
It's really just a personal thing. I used to make programs, TV programs, documentaries and films and stuff for TV. And somebody sent me a screenplay. A guy I knew quite well sent me a screenplay he'd been trying to sell for a drama series about the Great Train Robbery. And I started looking, and he wanted me to kind of see if I could see a way of improving or a way to do it that would maybe make it more saleable and get past the commissioning process. So I started looking at the stuff, and I thought, I got the Wikipedia version of it effectively from the script. And I thought, there's got to be something more to this. If this thing's going to sell, we've got to say something more than how you see on Wikipedia. And so I kind of thought I'd do a bit of research, and I went to the National Archives, found that there was a massive amount of stuff there which nobody really even looked at. Then I started reading these witness statements I mentioned earlier, and I sort of suddenly began to see, actually, this thing that we think is what it is, it's not that, it's something else. And actually, the more I started looking at it, the more I thought, with the 50th anniversary coming out, I've got to just take this apart. And so that's what I did.
Does the story live on for you at all? Do you feel like there's still bits and pieces that you enjoy uncovering, or is it something that you've kind of sealed in your own mind?
No, I mean, when I do talks and stuff, and sometimes go to book fairs and do talks about the book, and often people come up and they say something about it, or they were around at the time, or they know something that you don't. And it's really fascinating just to talk to people about, the train side of it. I love trains, and obviously that's kind of part of the story. And there's people who come up with all sorts of interesting things. I still like the idea of the mythology, and I'm not in the book trying to spoil anybody's fun. I love it as much as anybody else, but it's sort of also like, I love the idea that somehow something is not what it seems, and that fascinated me. One of the most extraordinary things about the facts that I uncovered, and I'm basically, my jaw kept dropping open every time I picked up a document, but one of the most extraordinary things is this long trial that went on forever and ever. You know, the criminals were all defended by top QCs, i.e. top lawyers of the day, top barristers, people who actually get up and talk in court. Those guys, they don't come cheap, and they have the top guys. And I started thinking, well, hang on a sec. These guys are expensive to hire, and they had them for a hell of a long time, longer than anybody else. How much did that cost them? And so I asked Bruce, and he said, well, on average, we paid about £30,000, and this is 1963 money, 1964 money. We paid about £30,000 each. Now, £30,000 each paid to those guys, and they were defending people who were claiming to be innocent. Where did they think their clients were getting that £30,000 from? Where did they get it from? What do you reckon?
That's an excellent point. The layers of it run deep.
Those top barristers were all being paid with stolen money, and the money came from the Royal Mail. So if anybody benefited, as always, it was the lawyers.
Obviously, people who are fascinated by this story should go out and get your book, The Great Train Robbery, Crime of the Century, The Definitive Account. But there are so many other books, biographies, movies, TV adaptations of what you've seen and experienced out there. What else would you recommend is worth people checking out?
I think Bruce Reynolds' biography, although you have to take it with a massive pinch of salt, because you have to remember this guy is a fantasist. He's a very good storyteller. He's a very good self-promoter, but just as a book to read, I found it very entertaining. And I mean, I enjoyed my time with Bruce. We spent a lot of time together when I was doing my book. And I think it's a great book. It gives you an idea. You have to sort of read a little bit between the lines, but it gives you a really interesting insight into a man who I think, was pretty extraordinary bloke, really. I mean, he was a sort of kind of one of a kind. And I think that book, although he didn't actually write it, of course it was ghostwritten, but it comes from him. And I think it's a really enjoyable book, and it's kind of good fun to read. It keeps you turning the pages.
Well, Nick, thank you so much for coming here on the Roundhouse to share this fascinating story with these multiple complex layers. Definitely check out his book, guys. I'll have a link in the show notes for you to read it. Nick, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot for inviting me, and good luck with your show.
And now, the question of the day.
Recently on the Roundhouse, we interviewed Robin Coombs, a fantastic railway photographer. And I asked you guys, what photographer inspires you? A lot of interesting responses, a lot of people whose work I had to look up. This from Jeremy D'Souza: Shirley Colin Gifford for truly creative work that inspired a generation of photographers. Kelly Lynch writes, Jack Delano, all the way. And lastly, from Nicholas Arthur Rezar, classic era would have to be O. Winston Link, because it's just so impressive. But for modern times, probably Walter Scriptunas. All very interesting photographers with different perspectives on what it means to capture railroading. If you're a photographer out there, send me your work, show me what you do. I love to see how we share these machines and the people that work on them. Your question of the day for this episode is, what questions do you have about the Great Train Robbery? I'm considering doing a follow-up interview with Nick because there's just so much detail here that we couldn't capture it all, even in as lengthy an episode as this, and it merits revisiting. So if there's something that we didn't cover in this episode that you'd like to learn about, let me know in the comments section on the roundhousepodcast.com or on social media. Either way, guys, thank you so much for joining us here today for this fascinating tale. Remember, we are on Patreon. If you want to help support the show, help us to grow and do bigger and better episodes, please head over to patreon.com/theroundhouse. And even just donating as little as $1 a month is going to help us to do some really cool stuff down the road. Last thing to mention is that our next episode is going to be the Joliet Rocket. But we're going to be doing something a little different for that, and it's going to take a little extra time to put it together. So hang in there while we get that one underway. Thank you guys for joining us, and remember that the Roundhouse is our house.